So I'm going to be selfish in the questions that I ask because I'm going to ask questions that I've had for you for a while. And if first of all, if people want to learn more about emerging strategies and reactive training systems, you've got one of the best YouTube channels, in my opinion. And you talk about
Oh,
these things
thanks.
at length, and you dive into specific topics of exercise selection and peaking and what is a pivot block, and you've got an entire one of your seminars, you've got an entire lecture on YouTube. So Mike dives into this stuff for free, and it's all over the internet. So I want to kind of just dive into some of these topics a little bit that you're discussing. You gave us a nice little framework there. You talked about three different types of athletes. On average, you see kind of three responses. That type 1 athlete is more of what we would consider ideal, maybe, where they just kind of they get better and better and better until they don't anymore, and that's when it's time to switch it up. It's more of like that logical progression of what you would think, where that type 2 or 3 maybe not so much, where the type 2 is maybe an initial dip and then they react more like a type 1, it sounds like. And the type 3 is a real head scratcher, where they don't seem to be responding well to the training, or just kind of not poorly, but just not progressing necessarily. Those are the athletes that I have a hard time with, because you don't know, should I stick with this? Like, let's just, from an emerging strategy standpoint, how long am I sticking with this microcycle until maybe it's just time to switch it up? Maybe this particular set of exercises is not the set of exercises for them, versus, you know what, it's been 7 weeks and they haven't really responded. Let's give it another 2 or 3 weeks and see how they're doing. See if we hit that peak for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Do you have a heuristic on that, or is it more of just, intuition?
Well, fortunately, the type 3 is probably the rarest response type. It's also important to note that it's not like you're locked into one of these, like if you have a type 1 response, then you're always a type 1.
Yeah.
It'll change from block to block. So once you get a sense of an athlete's time to peak, it gets to be a lot easier. If like, take me for example, I'm 6 exposures, roughly 6 weeks as my time to peak. And I'm in a block right now where I'm in week 3 and not a lot's happening. And it can be a little bit demoralizing, I guess, where you kind of go, man, I don't know, maybe I should pull the plug on things. Maybe this just isn't working, right? But it's also only week 3. And I would say if nothing's happening by week 4, maybe, but like for me right now, hey, some things are starting to move on some of the assistance exercises. Maybe that's a leading indicator, and just hang in there a little bit longer, I think that's a good way to go. Now, if it's like your first block and you really just don't know, then it's all exploration anyway. You may say, it's just not worth it to continue. Let's pull the plug on this and try something else. That's totally fine to do. It's fine to have a few false starts, I guess, while you're trying to figure some of this stuff out. Like peaking at different times is one that tends to come up a lot. In general, I find that lifters squat, bench, and deadlift peak in pretty much the same number of exposures. One of them might be off by 1 exposure or something like that, but they're grouped pretty tightly. Sometimes I'll hear about somebody whose bench is half the number of exposures as the other 2 or something like that. And what I find is usually when that's happening, it's something is off in the program. They just didn't respond well to this, or something like that. If you get the variables dialed in well, I think that the lifts generally peak together. And I would say that, it takes a little while to figure that stuff out. And just like with the response type thing, it can take a little while to sort it out, but that's all right. There's kind of this known versus unknown problem that comes up quite a bit. There's a lot of things where it's like, well, you just don't know. You have to figure it out. It's going to take a while to figure it out, and that kind of feels bad, right? because we're sitting here as coaches and we go, man, I don't want to, take 3 months and figure it out. But that was going to be true anyway. It's just that with a top-down approach, we're pretending that we know the answer now. That's just not true, though.
I think something to touch on with that is through a long enough time scale, you as an athlete or even as a coach dealing with athletes will see somebody go from a type 1 to a type 2 to a type 3. Mm-hmm. The knowns and unknowns change and shift. And even, going back a little bit, talking about going back to your greatest hits. Your greatest hits might be within a time frame that's actually acceptable, and the stuff from 2 years ago might not still be true. So those things constantly change. And I think a lot of people get locked into this, mindset of 6 weeks until, a bigger bench, or 12 weeks until whatever. You really have to look at it at much longer time scales and really understand that 9 months from now, you're going to be a different athlete and maybe in a different place.
Yeah.
The one thing that I've wanted to ask is, when you have athletes that go through those dips, what do you do mindset wise with those individuals? Because that can be really frustrating, to see a lot of momentum or see some stagnation and see a dip in progress. What do you do at that point? Because we see it in rehab as well, because it's not a linear process.
You stole my question, John. Damn it.
Sorry.
That's all we're going to hear from Jared then.
Gone.
It's for me, of course it's situationally dependent, and you kind of develop that relationship with an athlete a lot, right? But I know one thing that's helped me a lot are these block reviews. Part of the block review process is the charting of progress, and I remember I had a lifter who would improve for 2 weeks and then regress for a week, and then improve for 2 and then regress for 1. So they weren't like real peaks. It's not like that single regression was a real true peak condition. It was just like a bad workout every third workout, but it was fairly predictable. And so I remember she was, 2 or 3 weeks out from a major competition, has the bad workout, and it's like, oh, this is so frustrating. I don't even want to do the competition anymore. Like, you get these comments, and like, I've been there, right? But it was so great. I was able to pull out these block reviews and say, look, this happens every time. You have 2 good ones and a bad one. This was just the bad one. We're going to have 2 good ones, and it'll be right on the meat. This is it. It's like that regression is an indicator now that we're on pace, and that was really, really useful in terms of being able to say, okay, actually, I'm fine, and this is going to be fine.
That's a really interesting example, because it sounds like you were able to use that and not spin it, but use it as evidence to support the idea that this is just how things go and we're fine.
Right.
Do you ever find that it goes the other way, where it almost becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy? Say if your athlete recognizes that there's this pattern that exists, and then it's that third workout or that third microcycle, and they're just not pushing themselves as hard, and it just perpetuates that way, when there could be some progress that could potentially be made, but we just don't know.
Sure. I haven't noticed that in particular, but I'm sure that's plausible, right? Mm-hmm. One thing I've noticed that's kind of in that direction, we have people track like their feelings of soreness, feelings of fatigue, motivation to train, things like that. Mm-hmm. I think that's useful, especially in a remote environment. You would normally assess these things, just through normal human interaction. So we have a process around it. But sure. I noticed that, like, through this process, that would freak a lot of people out. They would see those numbers in the red, and they just mentally couldn't handle that. So for those people, it's like, maybe this isn't a useful tool, and we'll just kind of get away from that, because it kind of becomes that psychologically damaging kind of thing.